Good evening. Today is the 10th day of November 2020. Time is 6 o'clock. We'd like to begin our work session. We begin work sessions with our public comments, and we'll end our work session with public comments. So right now, we don't have anyone that signed up for the public comment period, so we'll just ask any of those that want to make public comments to go ahead, and you'll have 3 minutes. So if you just indicate if you want to make public comments on non-agenda items, just let us know. If you want to unmute, hit *6. I don't see anyone unmuting, so we'll close the public comment period and go to the first item, which is our work session on the Casper Aquifer Nitrate Loading Study in Laramie, Wyoming. Darren, are you going to introduce this to us, or who's introducing?
Mayor, this is Janine.
Oh, good, Janine. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you, Council. I will pass this off to Darren, and of course he is there in the room with you this evening. He will segue to our consultant to present the findings of the most recent study. Just in way of background, as you know, we adopted in 2008 the Casper Aquifer Protection Plan, or the CAP. Since the adoption of that plan, some now 12 years ago, the city's completed a good handful, perhaps a dozen, of additional research studies and investigations to try to understand the aquifer a little bit better, and notably understand it better so that we can better protect our water source. Last year in 2019, we completed phase 1 of the current nitrate loading study. Wank and Associates completed that study, and it was an assessment of septic system impacts out in Albany County, just outside the city boundary. That was a joint city-county project. That 2019 study's findings suggested a phase 2 study proceed, and that is the results that you'll be receiving tonight, is the phase 2 of that septic system impact assessment. With that, I will let Darren take over in chambers there, and he will give you a little bit of more information about the consultant's work, and then the consultants will present that. I'll just end by noting for you that the City Council's approved budget for this work was $19,800. This project did come in on time and within budget. Thank you.
Thank you. Darren, it's yours.
Honorable Mayor and Council, to build on what Janine said, one of the recommendations from that 2019 study, which I will add, I think all of you have seen the presentation on that and seen that report, but if anybody has any questions about that, I'm available anytime to answer those questions. But one of the recommendations that came from the 2019 study was to do an estimation of the nitrate loading to the Casper Aquifer in the area for the purpose of evaluating appropriate residential density for future development as warranted. So essentially what we did is we followed that recommendation, and this had actually been recommended to us prior to even the 2019 study by the former Southeast District engineer of the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality. He's no longer with that organization, but he had recommended that we do this study as well. And essentially what it is a nitrate loading model that's done to Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality standards for the entire buildable footprint over the Casper Aquifer recharge area in various different scenarios, various different rural residential developments that are allowed, the densities that are allowed under current county zoning and building regulations. And so that's what this study is. And with that, I will turn it over to Mark Stacy with Wank Associates. Mark is based in Fort Collins, and he is their senior hydrologist and is a professional geologist registered in the state of Wyoming and many other states as well. And so with that, Mark can take it.
Thank you. Welcome, Mark. Go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been an honor having the opportunity to do this follow-up study, as Darren mentioned. And it's been interesting. We came into this with no preconceived notions, and we were looking to just identify what concentrations might look like under various scenarios. So I do have a PowerPoint presentation. Could we start that up and get rolling from there?
Okay, Mark, I think we're up.
Looks good. I see that. So let's go to the next slide. So as Darren mentioned, we're looking at our project area is basically just the Casper Aquifer Protection Zone. So you see in yellow and green, yellow is zone 2. That's where the city's well fields are, as I'm sure you're all aware. Zone 3 is the green, farther up in the recharge area. So, you know, it's still a big area, but it's still critical, obviously, to protecting the city's water supply. Whatever happens up in this area has consequences, as you all know from previous studies, to the city's well fields and to the residential residences that live out there. So let's move on to the next slide, please. The purpose here, Darren kind of touched on it, but really we wanted to identify what the potential nitrate loading effects were to the Casper Aquifer under both current and future development in this area. The real key is identifying, you know, what happens to nitrates as you build in this area with all different manner of, you know, subdivisions and houses and septic systems. You know, what ultimately potentially happens to nitrate concentrations at the city's well fields. That was of principal concern to us and to the city, obviously, in the context of the entire study, was what really happens, what might happen. I'll emphasize might, because it is a model. What might happen to nitrate concentrations at those well fields? So next slide, please. Geologic setting. The one thing I will touch on here is the fact that, you know, the Casper formation, the Casper Aquifer, is approximately 700 feet thick. And it is protected by the Satanka Shale. So obviously the protection area was defined basically based on how the Satanka protects the area. And one thing about the model is principally focused on a volume and concentration basis. So when you think about this model, I don't want you to think of it as a be-all, end-all. This is the absolute answer, because there's a lot to this aquifer that's not really represented by what goes into the model. And you'll see that a little bit more. But I just want to emphasize the fact that, you know, the Casper is very thick. The DEQ typically recommends and looks at nitrate as in having an impact on the upper 30 feet of an aquifer. So when you look at 30 feet in the context of 750 feet, I just want to give you a little bit of context to think about it in that context and think about what does this mean for, say, the shallower parts of the Casper Aquifer versus the deeper parts. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. Hydrogeologic conditions, again, kind of, you know, we kind of touched on this. The Satanka is our confinement point. So anything that was west of the Satanka outcrop in that 75-foot level, we, you know, basically did not include in our model. Any residences to the west of that, we did not include. We wanted to make sure we were focused on only the area that could potentially be affected by existing development and future development in an area where the aquifer could be directly affected. So obviously we've got east to west flow. I will point out the fact that, you know, the saturated thickness at the top of the range is basically 0, where you've got Sherman granite out there. And then that saturated thickness increases to the west, where we've got the springs right at the Satanka contact. So just other things to keep in mind as you look at this model and what it's actually representing. Next slide, please. So here's where the rubber meets the road on the model. As I mentioned, it's a volume concentration model. We use the Wehrman model, which is what DEQ requires for subdivision applications in the state of Wyoming. And as Darren and I talked about, going back to the beginning of this model, we wanted to use this model because Seth Turney with DEQ at the time had suggested an approach like this to try and get an idea of not just on a subdivision by subdivision basis, but on a holistic perspective with respect to the aquifer, what might those down gradient concentrations for nitrate look like if we looked at it in that larger picture context. So we're really taking a model that's designed for a subdivision use, but we're applying it in essence to the whole aquifer. So you can see from what's presented here in the equation, there's several different components. There's a volume of water that comes in from upgrading the area. There's components coming from precipitation, from septic, anything that might be pumped out. Those are the big picture components of the model. And I will point out a couple things here that because of the way the model area sets up, we essentially looked only at the impact of concentration into the model based on infiltrating precipitation and septic system inputs. Any components assigned to volumes that we would pump out of the aquifer or that would be coming into the aquifer from the east were eliminated because we felt that anybody living up here is probably just going to be using water for household purposes and not irrigating outside. And the second reason is because the saturated thickness on the eastern edge of the aquifer is 0. So effectively the input is 0 on that side. Let's go to the next slide. So in order to model a gigantic area like this, the first thing to do is break it down into manageable pieces. So to do that, we basically looked at the existing well field areas, which are shown, Spur, Turner, Hope, Soldier, and then Simpson Springs, relative to the water table in the area. In the water table map and the way that water flows through the Casper Aquifer as best as we know from recent water table maps of the aquifer. So doing that, it allowed us to discretize the area into 5 manageable blocks where we could model the concentrations at each of these well fields and how those impacts at the well field might affect or might be affected by current buildup versus future buildup. So that was really the strategic key to the approach here in terms of trying to make it realistic or representative, if you will, to what we recorded at those different well fields and what might be recorded in the future under the different conditions. Next slide, please. So current nitrate concentrations. You might be wondering, okay, why would we use current nitrate concentrations? One of the things that's key here is the model only gives you a couple different ways to put nitrate into it. So the way that we decide to use nitrate or introduce nitrate into the model was through precipitation. The USGS is another place that suggested that the nitrate concentration may be very low in infiltrating precipitation, but for purposes of our model here, the only way to effectively get it in with this model was to introduce it through precipitation. So I'll just point that out. So effectively, the concentrations that we saw, that are noted here in terms of the upgradient concentrations, were generally used along with a component of precipitation to introduce nitrate into the model to see how that would, come down with the septic influence. The downgradient concentrations were going to be used in pump groundwater, but ultimately were not. So they're just here as kind of a placeholder to see, so you can see how things change. Obviously, there's differences in upgradient and downgradient concentrations. I don't fully understand why some upgradient concentrations are higher than downgradient concentrations. But I will say this, and Bern can back me up on this, there are concentrations of nitrate that are all over the map. And you've probably seen those in previous studies. So these were the numbers we ran with because we felt that they were most representative in the areas, particularly for what might be being introduced through precipitation. Next slide, please. So for looking at current nitrate concentrations, we basically took the current zoning map and we used the 2020 registered addresses that were available from Albany County to identify what had already been built upon. And identified those as, part of the current build-out. Basically, if there's development to date, that's what we consider to be current build-out. And from there, so those areas that we consider to be current build out are highlighted in kind of a light green hatch pattern. You see down in the legend that note, but you can see where the addresses kind of overlap with that area. So you get a sense of where the current build out has been, where current building has been, and how that affects, the areas that we looked at. Next slide, please. Okay, so for future build out, so in this instance, we basically took out anything that we considered under current build out and looked for only those areas where we didn't have existing development. And we also considered lands that, were owned by BLM, City of Laramie, Mountain Cement, State of Wyoming, et cetera, as being undevelopable, and essentially excluded those. So that included a sizable area there with Pilot Hill, Mountain Cement. That takes out a lot of the area, let's say from Laramie to the south, east of Laramie, in that area. So basically there's a lot of land down there, which is essentially considered undevelopable. And then most of the developable land winds up being up in the Spur Wellfield area and Turner Wellfield areas, as you can see from that picture. Let's go to the next slide, please. So for the future build-out scenarios, we essentially just took the county's documentation in terms of the residential lot sizes that they've recognized, considering small lot residential at 2 acres, rural residential at 5 acres, and agricultural zoning at 35-acre lots. So those are the three conditions where we basically took the developable land and identified, okay, how many developable lots do we actually have in here based on the amount of acreage that's available. Next slide, please. So this table summarizes what we identified as the current build out by by modeled aquifer block, by wellfield, if you will. So it shows that 45 lots are in Spur, and then most of the development is in the Turner Wellfield area in the Pope Spring Wellfield, where you've got 199 and 235 lots. So when you look at future build out scenarios, if you scan across by wellfield, you'll notice there's a significant difference, a significant increase in the number of residences that would be built in the Spur and Turner wellfields as you increase or as you decrease that lot size. Notice that for agricultural zoning, we're talking 446, 519, but notice that as you decrease the zoning size to 5-acre lots and 2-acre lots, you go from, for Turner, 519 to 2442 and then 5805. Those 2 wellfield areas get a significant amount more development than any of the other 3 wellfield areas, just because of the limitations of developable land in those areas. So as you look at those, as you look at the numbers, you'll see that plays a significant aspect in what we noticed. Let's move to the next slide, please. So we initially looked at current build out results, and so what you'll notice is Darren had provided us 2020 measured wellfield nitrate concentrations in the middle column. And what we did was effectively model to see, okay, given our current build out that we've identified, how does our model represent current build out? And what we noticed is that for Spur, Soldier, and Simpson, the model reasonably agrees pretty well with the concentrations we've observed. Where it did not agree particularly well is at Pope Springs and at Turner. And I think the reason for that is because of the fact that Turner and Pope are 2 of the most developed at this point in time. So they have more nitrate going in. But this also points out the fact that this model is not perfect. It does not perfectly simulate these nitrate concentrations. But it does give us a relative sense of what's happening as we look at different scenarios. So I would encourage you to look at it in that kind of context and think about it as a big picture as opposed to, to a 100th of a decimal. So by and large, it looks like we've got a reasonable, we've got reasonable agreement, but it's not perfect. So let's move to the next slide, please. So then we moved on to future build out scenarios. And what you'll notice as you move from left to right, from agricultural at 35-acre lots to rural residential at 5-acre lots to small lot residential at 2-acre lots, is that there are significant increases in nitrate concentrations that we've estimated at the well fields, given these different build-out scenarios. So keep in mind, these are assuming that everything's built out, that it's built out at those lot sizes, and that this is like the end of that development. So if everything was in place, everything was built on 5-acre lots or 2-acre lots, this is what it might look like under those scenarios. So let's look at Turner and Pope. Sorry. Let's look at Pope, because what you notice about Pope is that things don't change appreciably through time. And I think this speaks to the fact that there's just not a lot of developable land. You see the same thing at Soldier. There's only 80 acres of developable land, so it just doesn't see a lot of impact. So it doesn't really matter what size you will, the lot size you use in those areas, just because there's so little developable land, it doesn't significantly change them. The other thing that I will point out is that these mild nitrate concentrations are based on two different things. You'll notice that at the bottom. So under agricultural, you'll notice the column on the left is based on a 40 milligram per liter nitrate infiltrating concentration, which is what the DEQ requires for modeling purposes. Column on the right under agricultural is at 55, and that's based on our 2019 study in terms of what we found out there in the study area where we worked. So it does make a difference in terms of, where we're looking at 40 or 55, but by and large, it depends on which area and what lot size we're talking about. So you'll notice that, say, Spur and Turner, their concentrations go from 6 and 8 or 4 and 5 all the way up for agricultural. But when you start looking at small lot residential, we're talking 25 to 34 milligram per liter concentrations. And the thing to keep in mind on all this is that the EPA standard for drinking water is 10 milligram per liter. So anything over 10 is not good. Let's just put it that way. Again, I'll reiterate that these are not absolute values. These are estimates based on the way the model is set up. But I will emphasize the fact that it does give you a picture of what potentially might happen in these areas if development were allowed to continue at these lot sizes to, the full extent. Do they perfectly represent what will happen in the future? Not necessarily. There are definitely some aspects of dilution that are not particularly represented well in this model. But it does paint a picture that, small lot residential could have some significant impacts. For Spur and Turner, and rural residential likewise could be the same. So let's go to the next slide, please. So just to highlight a couple things. Clearly in our current build out, it looks like most everything stays below 5 milligram per liter nitrate. Doesn't really have a significant impact on things. In the future build out under agricultural zoning, looks like it would only have a limited impact on the aquifer. Let's go to the next slide, please. So for future build out scenarios, it looks like Pope, Soldier, and Simpson are likely to see nitrate concentrations rise, but still remain below that EPA MCL. But rural residential zoning and small lot residential zoning would both have, significant impacts potentially on Turner and Spur well fields. That basically is what we discovered from the modeling. Again, it's not perfect, but it does give us a qualitative sense of what might happen under different scenarios. And that was really the point of the study, was to see what might it look like, how bad might it look like, how concerned should we be as a city. But as I pointed out before, and Bern can attest to this too, nitrate concentrations in some wells now are already at 10. So this is not, the model's not perfect, and we're playing with a natural system that has, got variability to it. So these are all things to keep in mind. But in a qualitative basis, I mean, I think we can get the big picture that, you know, the more nitrate, the more systems you put in there, the more likely you are to have an impact. So with that, I'll wrap it up and we'll open it up to questions.
Thank you, Mark. We'll start with questions from the City Council, and then we also have some of the public that we'll go to after the council has had a chance for questions. So, council, just raise your hand and we'll take you. First of all, Councilor Harrington.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Sisi, I'm curious if the Wehrman model is, you mentioned a time or two that it's really more oriented towards a subdivision. Is there any scalability problems with that? I mean, are we looking at something where if we were to take the same data and run it through maybe a different model, that we would be looking at wildly different results? Or is this sort of a, I mean, do you feel confident that this is, at least given variability, of course, relatively accurate, given that sort of the model maybe being not the most appropriate tool?
I think it gives us some ballpark numbers. Part of the problem, and others have seen this too, is if you only model one subdivision and then you model another subdivision immediately next to it and another one immediately next to it, you don't get a sense of an aggregate effect. That was just some concern with DEQ, and that's part of the reason why he wanted to at least look at it in this context to see what does it look like if you add this all together, what might it look like? So I would say it's accurate in the sense of a ballpark. You know, what type of ballpark are we looking at if we have, you know, 2-acre lots, 5-acre lots, or 35-acre lots? So from that perspective, I think it's not reliable in its absolute numbers, but in the ballpark sense of the numbers it's giving us, I think it's giving us a reasonable idea of what we might expect.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, Vice Mayor Gabriel, and then we'll go to Councilor Weaver.
Thank you, Mayor. Mark, thank you for the presentation. I wanted to go back to the Spur Turner small lot presentation that you talked about. Developable lands, 25 to 34, nitrate levels, the possibility there. Can you tell us how those are calculated? I mean, that's very significant when you talk about 10 is not, anything over 10 is not very good.
Right.
So can you tell me how that was developed, that scenario from 25 to 34 in Spur and Turner?
So the difference between and I don't have it in front of me. Can we go back to that slide, please? The difference between, you know, the two columns. Okay, small lot residential, Turner Wellfield. One miles at 25 and one miles at 34. The reason for the difference between those two columns comes down only to the changing the septic effluent nitrate concentration level from 40 to 55. So the DEQ has advocated that, you know, for all subdivisions, you base it on a 40 milligram, you assume a 40 milligram per liter nitrate effluent concentration for all your Wehrman models. The reason why we did the 55 was based on what we saw last year when we did the study out in Sherman Hills. So that explains the principal reason for the differences between those two. If you look at what's in the model numbers for that small lot residential area, that's the only thing we changed between those two columns, was just that nitrate concentration value. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and you talked about, Mark, about no expectations going into this study. I was just curious, after completing this, did anything surprise you or anything come out that you really didn't expect?
I think I was kind of surprised that Pope, Soldier, and Simpson weren't more impacted. But again, that goes back to the amount of developable land. And I'd say overall, what we really were what really impressed us was how much the amount of developable land had, an impact on potential for adverse impact. Clearly, it indicates that the more potentially you can build out there, the more likely you are to have, adverse impact on your well fields.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Councillor Weaver?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Stacy, thanks a lot for this presentation and the breakdown of all the information. I'd like to ask you two questions. The first is, if you were able to improve aspects of data collection or anything in the methodology here so that you could have a better product, what would that be? What would those be?
That's a great question. I wish I had a really good answer for you right now, but I don't. I'm trying to think. I think about the possibility of doing this on a three-dimensional basis, three-dimensional groundwater model basis. One of the things I mentioned is that this model kind of takes that 700-foot package of the entire aquifer and basically considers it to be one unit. It doesn't discretize between the upper part of the aquifer versus the lower part of the aquifer. And I know that was one of the things that was a concern on several people's mind with respect to our nitrate study last year was, oh, we got 55 milligram per liter nitrate coming into the unsaturated zone, coming into the aquifer, but we've got all this material down beneath this. I mean, it's a valid question. So how likely is that material to get all the way through? If you could do a three-dimensional groundwater model on it and try and model the different units and the different permeabilities and the interconnections, it's going to add a lot of complexity and uncertainty, but just because we don't have all those details. But it might give you a little bit more detail about which part of the aquifer should we be most concerned about, where might we be most concerned about it, and where might we see the worst impacts. And you could also potentially get an idea about, from a timing perspective. This model looks at it from the gross standpoint of everything's built, what's the final result. So it looks at it like as a steady state, one size fits all, whereas we know that's not the way that development typically goes. Development typically progresses and increases. We get more houses, more subdivisions, et cetera. And by that point, it's too late to, go back. So I do think a three-dimensional groundwater model would be helpful, but I also think it would not necessarily be easy to build with the data we have at this point in time. So there are a lot of nitrate data. So one place I think it might be helpful would be to have more monitoring wells or some monitoring wells up in the aquifer that would tell us more about how the nitrate concentrations change down through the aquifer. I know Bern kind of worked on one around the Sherman Hills Fault. And we've had discussions about how the wells at the Sage Wellfield are fully penetrating, but a lot of the domestic wells are partially penetrating, potentially could be adversely affected by stuff coming down from the surface. They're too shallow. What if they're fully penetrating? Would they have the same issues? So I think it would be helpful to have some nitrate observation wells at multiple levels throughout the Casper that would tell us, okay, what do we have shallow versus as we go deeper? How much of a concern should we have? Do we have a uniformity of concentration through, or do we have variability? I do think that
would give us an assessment across a gradient. I'm sorry to cut you off, Mr. Seavey. I want to ask you my other question, and then so we can finish up and let other counselors move on. My second question is, how can we use what you've given us here and in the past with some of the other information that you've given us, how does that complement, or how could it possibly complement some other data that we've recently been able to collect using the imaging studying, the aerial imaging studying that you're probably familiar with that has been recently provided? Because I think what we need to do from a policy perspective, working with partners across the community, is we need to begin to start to combine the information and the data that we've received from the various studies and the products that we have been given into a package that's going to help us start taking a look at policy points that we may want to explore. How does this most recent work that you've given us best complement some of the other most recent information we've been giving? And the one that comes to the top of my mind, of course, is that aerial imaging study.
Yeah, so I think, as we start looking at the lot sizes and potential areas in the imaging that's been done, obviously the most sensitive things we have up in the cap are the recharge areas, the faults, the fractures, drainage channels where, if nitrates get in those areas in significant concentrations, they can cause significant adverse consequences to anybody down gradient. So that'd be a place where I think it would be interesting to see, can you use that information to better identify areas where we want to specifically make sure we maintain a buffer or some separation or some distance to prevent any kind of immediate infiltration of, nitrate effluent to those areas.
Well, that's really important. That's really important because what I think I just gathered from what you said there is the combination of this these different sets of data might actually help us come up with a more precise and more targeted set of policies for specific areas in the aquifer, rather than trying to say, oh, we need to have this blanket approach to the entire area, but in fact might help us have a guide path to targeted types of areas that we might want to pay more attention to. And I'm just going to guess that we'd probably need some more information before we could be that precise, but it would get us on the path towards that. That's very, very interesting. I've got to give it up here because I know other people want to ask questions, but I appreciate the answers. I do. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Other council members like to ask questions? Yes, Councilor Doherty.
Would you mind repeating? You said that, was it the EPA says the estimate of 40 milligrams per liter per septic system? Was that the EPA estimate? And then you modeled it with 55 also?
Yeah, so Wyoming DEQ, in absence of any other data, wants you to assume that the effluent nitrate concentration is 40 milligrams per liter. That's their assumption right now.
Okay, that's kind of scary because if we found, if the other study found higher with a residence with just a couple people, then that's probably the 40 milligrams per liter is probably pretty low, huh? It seems to be.
Well, yeah. One thing we got to keep in mind there too is it's a volumetric loading concern. So if you've got 2 people putting in 55 milligram per liter nitrate versus 8 people putting in 55 milligram nitrate, the 8 people are going to be putting more water of a higher concentration in than the 2 people. So we have to think about it in that context too.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yep.
City Clerk, we have some people that are wanting to speak with the public. Do you want to go through your list and then we'll open it up to the rest of the public?
Absolutely. Bern Hinckley?
Yeah, okay. Let's see if I can get all my pieces going here. Okay, hi. Aquifer, that's the Casper Aquifer over my shoulder. Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Bern Hinckley, I've prepared some remarks so I can stay within your 3 minutes to respect the time of the commission. I live at 508 South 11. I'm a hydrogeologist by profession and personal interest. I'm a registered professional geologist in Wyoming. My familiarity with the Casper Aquifer here in Laramie began with watching the water shooting out of the ground during the drilling of the Turner 2 well in 1981. So I've got some years with this aquifer. I've read the Wenck report in detail, and I've enjoyed the opportunity to visit with Mr. Stacy and his colleagues on some of the details of it, and we can talk geology all night. But my comments here are not to dispute any of their findings, but to provide some context and some caution in how we use the results, which I think speaks to Aaron and Paul's questions. First, I'm not sure the report correctly captures the idea of developable land. Most conspicuously, all the holdings by Mountain Cement are considered never to be developed. This obviously reduces the potential for nitrate loading in the area, perhaps leading to a more relaxed planning posture than is entirely justified. This is all private land. Mountain Cement could go into the subdivision business tomorrow if they wanted to. So let's consider that. They would be limited by county zoning regulations, of course, which means that those regulations should be carefully monitored. BLM land is also assumed to be off limits. There is no binding commitment from BLM precluding future development there. Even the Pilot Hill project lands are under recreational leases that expire at various points in the future and include large parcels of university-owned lands for which there is no actual management agreement that's been finalized at this point. Second, the staff policy goal statement for this project says it is, quote, to determine the level of development that the Casper Aquifer can safely sustain, unquote. So we need to think real carefully about what we mean by safely and sustain. Mark's report doesn't go there, nor was he asked to, but it uses the EPA drinking water standard nitrates, 10 milligrams per liter as the obvious benchmark. And yes, that is the EPA limit. And if that limit is exceeded in a public water supply, it becomes illegal to serve that water to the public. But I would ask, is our water quality goal to remain just within the legal limit? And if so, what is a reasonable margin to ensure our water supply remains legal? Is our policy barely legal, comfortably legal, or what? Or is our goal non-degradation, which many of us drinkers of this water would favor? And by that standard, no development is sustainable, as any development carries with it an increment of water quality degradation. In an ideal world, I think we would all agree that we would like our drinking water to be as pure as nature provided it. But we compromise from that high standard to accommodate legitimate development interests. How far do we want to compromise?
3 minutes
That's
have expired, so.
Okay, well, I can stop there if you'd like.
Okay. Mr. Stacy, I think there are some questions in there if you want to tackle those.
I'll just comment that I think Bern makes some very salient points, particularly with the developable land. Darren and I had discussions about what we would consider developable, and that was how we wound up on the areas that we considered developable and part of the study. So Bern's absolutely right. If Mountain Cement turns into a developer tomorrow and sells all its lands, then yeah, then I would revisit the study here. That point is well taken. I also think his comments about what is optimal, what do we as a city want in terms of quality of water we provide our drinking water is something that everyone should think about very carefully. Those are all excellent points, Bern. Thank you.
Thank you. City Clerk, who do you have next?
Paul Taylor.
Paul, you're still muted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can now. Go ahead.
Sir.
Okay, I'm going to follow up on Bern's comments. My name is Paul Taylor. I have been a resident of Laramie since 1995, a dual citizen of Australia and the US. I would like to comment on behalf of AQUA, Albany County Clean Water Advocates, and as a community artist educator. AQUA sincerely endorses and echoes the comments of Bern on the Wenck report. We maintain that we are not that we not be simply satisfied with meeting EPA contamination standards. Instead, we advocate to shoot as high as possible in protecting our precious water resources in all our development decision making. And as Byrne indicated, we need to proceed with caution. As a student and teacher of Aboriginal culture and wisdom for 30 years, I have taught the primary essence of 50,000-year-old Aboriginal law to kids throughout this state. And as the law states, we must care for country before anything else. You care for your land first, which is your mother, so you can feed your kids with good food and clean water. And this in turn teaches us to care for each other. This was and still is survival for the world's oldest living culture. Following on from this thinking, in their legal system, both land and water are considered sacred. Applying this wisdom to our development decision making makes sense and demands we too shoot as high as we can in protecting our precious sacred resources. And it demands we pay attention to our land, our water, and yes, proceed with caution. Thank you.
Thank you.
We also have Maximus Passari.
Mr. Maximus, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Stacy, thank you for your presentation. I have a couple of questions for you. First one is pretty straightforward. You succinctly delineated the problem set, so I'm wondering if he has a recommended or more than one recommended courses of action to deal with the issue. And then the second one really starts with an assumption, the assumption being you're a subject matter expert. This is not a novel issue to you or a case of first impression. I'm sure you have seen situations where, you know, in this case, City of Laramie has a water source that is extraterritorial in nature. And as some speakers have mentioned, there are other partners involved, you know, including the county and an entity that sits right in the middle of the city, the university, which the authorities really stem from the state. So there's some legal issues there if the city were to try to control some of their actions. So the question really is, being a subject matter expert and having seen this before, what other communities have done to deal with issues such as this that perhaps some of our policymakers here could use instead of having to reinvent the wheels from scratch and possibly get it wrong because they're dealing with very complex issues of legal nature and science. Thank you.
Well, my focus in my career has been principally on groundwater development. I've dealt with some nitrate issues, but not exhaustively, and I'm not entirely or exhaustively familiar with those things. Byrne has brought some of those questions and thoughts up in previous conversations. But I would say that I think we've presented data here to help make some policy decisions. And ultimately, this really comes down to a question of policy for the city and the county, and collaboratively working on this to make sure that the resources we have are used beneficially and not adversarially or adversely. And there's tough choices to make here. You could look at it on one hand and just look at our recommendations and basically say, well, we shouldn't develop anything more than 35-acre lots. Okay, who can afford 35-acre lots? Well, that's a very limited class of people. Those are questions that go beyond science into what do people, what do communities want, that are difficult to answer. And our intent with this study was not so much to answer those directly as it was just to provide information that would help inform those decisions. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
So have Nancy Sindelar.
Nancy, I think you unmuted. Nancy Sindelar, did you want to make comments?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and Honorable Council. I spent quite a bit of time in Standing Rock learning about water. And you've all heard about thinking of seventh generation. Instead, I'd like you to think of being a good ancestor. That aquifer has been there for thousands of years and will be there in thousands of years, long after our names have worn off our gravestones. And we must work to be good ancestors so that they're not cursing the people back here that let our aquifer be despoiled. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to welcome Andy Somerville and Sharon Cumby. You don't have to make comments right now. You're still public for another month or so, but welcome to the presentation today, the work session. And if you want to speak to this topic, you're certainly welcome to do so. Anyone else in the public that would like to ask questions or make comments? All right. Let's go back to the City Council to wrap up any questions that you may have. And also, I will mention, because you're limited to 3 minutes, there is another opportunity to make some wrap-up comments if you want to wait till council comments at the end of the meeting, which is everything in general. So appreciate the input that the public has put into this. Appreciate the work that Mark has put into this, as well as our staff, Darren, and all that have worked on this. But council, anything you want to say? Councilor Stalder.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to everyone that's made comments. Is this going to be presented to the county commissioners? I mean, it seems like they have sort of more control over this land than we do.
I think that's a good question for Darren. It was not part of our scope to do so, but just as the Alvin County study was ultimately presented to the city of Laramie, I don't see any reason why we couldn't do the same thing there if so desired.
Councilor Stalder, I would say that this was a city project. The scope, as Mark said, was not to present to the county. Right now, there are not plans to present to the county, I guess. But we would certainly be, there's nothing to hide. We would, I think, like to get this information to them. If you remember, we had the joint work session not too long ago where the exchange of information on the aquifer is hopefully going to start soon to hopefully do a joint Casper Aquifer Protection Plan update starting in the spring of 21. And this is really the next to last study that will be completed before that process happens. The final study would be the phase 2 of the AEM Telephone Canyon study, which would be essentially the 3D flow modeling of groundwater flow into upgrading of the Pope and Soldier well fields. So I'm happy to, if directed, reach out to the county and see if they have an interest, and we can figure out a way, I'm sure, to get Wink to give this presentation to them as well. Obviously, this recharge area is in the county's jurisdiction. It's not in the city's. And in order, I think, to meet any kind of policy decisions, policy goals, well, we need to work on this collaboratively. So that would be my answer.
Awesome. Yeah, in the spirit of collaboration, it's one thing to read a study, but I think it would be awesome to present it to the county. And then my last question, I don't know, I mean, I could probably do the research myself, but of that light green developable land, how many landowners are there? Like, what does that represent in terms of what's available for development?
That developable land, Darren, feel free to comment on this one. I'm trying to remember. I think it's mostly different private landowners, but I'm not sure how many different landowners we're talking about.
I just wonder if, within the city's purview, there was an opportunity to do something, maybe not the same scale as the Pilot Hill project. But if that's land that we're concerned about and we don't really have any control over what the zoning is going to look like or what the county is going to do, you know, what do we do with this $20,000 study? I don't want it to just go on a shelf. Like, you know, is there something, and maybe this is a rhetorical question just to throw out there, but what are we going to do with this information? That's all.
Yes, Councilor Stalder, I guess as far as acquiring physical land out there, and you know, we've tried to do that in some of the more sensitive areas. Land acquisition is very expensive. Perhaps there are some creative things we can do to try to get a larger chunk of this in this APOZ out in the county. I would be certainly willing to look at any kind of possibility to make that happen. As far as this going on the shelf, yeah, I agree. We've spent a tremendous amount of money since the last Casper Aquifer Protection Plan was completed in 2008. We have multiple studies. We have lots of data. The city has spent many tens of thousands of dollars studying the Casper Aquifer. And the time is come to not allow that to just go on the shelf and be discarded, but roll all of that information that we've learned in the last 12 years into the next Casper Aquifer Protection Plan. And hopefully, as Councilor Weaver said, maybe we can make a more site-specific plan and identify areas that are very vulnerable, areas that aren't so vulnerable, take all this information. I think our next plan will be much better than the one we have now. It'll be a much finer scale and much more useful, and it'll actually contain parts that we can utilize in different geographical locations is my hope. So yes, I agree. We don't want to take all these this study and the rest of them and just, you know, consider that money wasted. It's all going to be utilized soon when we put the RFQ out, spring of 21. This study will go out with that RFQ with all the rest, and another consultant will take all this information and compile it into one big comprehensive report.
Thank you. Councilor Stalder, is that everything?
Yes, thank you, Mayor.
Councilor Pierce?
Yeah, my question is for Darren. When he speaks about spring going out with the RFQ, could it be winter? Could we move a little faster on this? So I'm talking maybe, 3 months or something.
Well, Councilor Pierce, I would say that the hope is that we are going to work on this together with Albany County. I think there's probably more discussion that needs to happen with the county and see what is going to happen there. This RFQ is going to be a big one. It's going to take quite a bit to put this together. I think logistically on the side of city staff, spring of 21 is probably pretty optimistic, but I think we're ready to go. It's sitting in the budget. We're hoping, I think we all agree here at the city, at least city staff, speaking for my peers that I work with here at the city, we would love to have our next plan be with Albany County. And as soon as we get a green light on what direction we want to go, as soon as some of these policy decisions are made by the policymakers, we'll start working on it immediately.
Thank you, Darren. Most of us are really anxious. So whatever we can do.
Vice Mayor Gabriel.
Thank you, Mayor. In light of what we've heard here tonight, it sounds like the spring of 2021, and looking back at our work session with the county commissioner, since we have a new commissioner coming in, I feel very optimistic that we're going to have a cooperative scenario with the other body. I think that I heard during the campaign that the aquifer protection was a big factor in the campaign. A lot was talked about it, and I think we had a very good, productive work session a couple of months ago, and now with a new commissioner, I can really see us moving forward and cooperating with this study and other studies that Dr. Carr has done. So I would just throw that out for discussion, and optimistic for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. I met this week with the new County Commissioner, Sue Ibarra, and her focus was, we're going to work with the city on making sure that we can do everything we can to protect the Casper Aquifer. So your comments are right where where this new county commissioner wants to focus, and I think that this gives us a lot of opportunity to open up and do everything we can to protect this precious resource that we have for the city and the county and the state. Anyone else? Councilor Weaver?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I appreciate that. And I appreciate everyone's comments. I think the sense of urgency that's been mentioned before is unfortunately not new. And I think it stems from several years of not having the level of information, data collection, and the types of monitoring and projects that we've wanted to see happen until fairly recently. And then we've had kind of, I would describe it as a crush of information within the last year or so. We've had more of that than we've had, I think, in a few years prior. And I also know that we've had some other studies done. I know we had an isotope study done with some partners at the University of Wyoming that we never got really a final report on. And that's another data point that I'd like to add to try to come up with a comprehensive set of data and information so that we can use that to help guide some policies. But I'm going to make a statement here that I think needs to be made, and it's a preemptive statement because, and this is a political comment, folks, and I feel a lot better about making it after all the speakers before me, at least the last two, made highly political comments, so I'm going to make it. And that is this, that there is not going to be an attempt to smash people's private property values through aquifer regulation. That is not the goal of the city council or any other group of elected officials in Albany County or Laramie. The goal is the necessary amount of groundwater protection and hopefully beyond the bare minimum standards, as we heard people allude to in earlier comments. That is the goal. That is the goal, is to protect and maintain a high quality groundwater resource for future consumption and future growth within the city of Laramie. And we intend to do that carefully. We intend to do that collaboratively and guided by data. And we will certainly try to do that with some speed, but we won't do it recklessly, and we won't do it by trying to reinvent the wheel. We'll look at other approaches that have been taken, and we'll work with partners, and we'll work with members of the community, and we'll do so in a way that does the maximum in terms of being able to both reach that goal of groundwater protection without destroying people's private property values to the best available extent. And I wanted to just say that loudly and clearly because I don't want there to be any misinterpretation or misstatement about what the policy goal here is. I appreciate that, Mr. Mayor. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilor Weaver. Anyone else? Mr. Stacy, anything you want to wrap up before we move on to on the agenda? Any other thoughts or comments?
No, I just would like to thank you again for the opportunity and for the ability to share the information with you, and look forward to seeing how it gets used to benefit the city. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Darren, anything you want to wrap up with?
No, Mr. Mayor, I think
okay.
There's nothing else.
All right, then we'll conclude this work session. We'll move on to the next item, which is on our agenda. Those of you who have your agenda in front of you, we have to include the city council updates and council comments, and then we'll go to the agenda review. So let's start with Councilor Weaver, and then we'll kind of work our way around to everyone on the council. Any updates that you have, Councilor Weaver, for us?
Well, Mr. Mayor, I think that in the near future, the city council is going to need to take a look at the future of our Laramie Youth Council and how we'd like to see that proceed, and what our goal is with that program, and talk to our partners at the school district and evaluate some successes that we've had in the past and where we'd like to see the future of that program move. And I have a second comment, which
let's save that for comments. This is updates.
Pardon me. Yeah, that's appropriate, Mr. Mayor. So that would be the only update I would have, except to say that we have 2 quality volunteers for our Monolith Ranch Advisory Committee moving forward, and I'd like to thank Councilor Schuster for assisting with the interview process there. He had a chance to interview them. I've had a chance to speak with them, and we're always grateful to have folks willing to volunteer on our important committees, not the least of which being the Monolith Ranch Advisory. That's it for updates. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Councilor Harrington?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The only update I have is the Economic Vitality Committee of Main Street met a couple hours ago, and they are working through sort of their guiding document, their work plan for 2021. I will, once that's finalized, I'll be sure to send it around to all of you so you can view it in detail. But several components will involve things from the Thrive plan. So they are getting to work on that, on sort of the downtown portion of it. So stay tuned, and that's my only update.
Councilor Pierce?
Thank you, Mayor. The only thing I have to add is I was on the committee to help pick the 2 pieces of artwork that will be on our pads for our Snowy Range Bridge. And I want to tell you, it was a great experience. And I just hope the community is as excited as I am to get those pieces of art in town and up for some, hopefully some great conversation and education and opportunity to just kind of be amazed to some extent. So I'm really excited about that. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Stalder?
Thank you, Mayor. My only update is from the airport board. The new terminal construction is coming along really well. I think you guys will all be pretty impressed when you finally get to have a walkthrough. It's going to make a great impression for Laramie. So I look forward to being amazed, like Councilor Pierce said.
Okay, great. Councilor Doherty?
I just want to give you a heads up. I'm going to testify before the Joint Corporations, Elections, and Political Subdivisions Committee tomorrow regarding net metering. And I think I can still say I'm a city councilor, but I won't say I'm speaking for the council. But what I'm trying to say is that I would request that they not tie our hands, that municipalities have a way to save money, save taxpayer money on our utilities, and also maybe have the possibility of raising revenue. So, so if they don't tie our hands with the net metering bill to reduce our ability to sell back to the grid, that I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Councilor Schuster?
No planning commission this week. Again, thank Paul Weaver for allowing me to be on the committee to interview him. 2 great candidates, so we didn't have to make a choice because 2 applied and we got to select 2. So we've had a problem with a lot of outside agencies where we've had too many good candidates and had to be the evil person that did not allow someone on there. Rifle Range Board meeting tomorrow night, and Historical Railroad Depot Thursday. So This month fell really weird that usually they're right after it. So now my updates on those two will be in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Gabriel?
Mayor, I've had no recent meetings, nothing to report.
Okay, any comments?
No.
Council comments? Comments, Councilor Schuster?
No, no comments.
Okay, Councilor Doherty, comments?
That's
Okay, Councilor Stalder,
No comment.
Councilor Pierce.
Yeah, Mayor, I do have one comment this evening, and I'd like to just bring attention to something that I think might be of some importance to our viewing community of folks who pay attention to our council meetings. And we have a new nonprofit that started in Laramie, according to our Laramie Boomerang, and it's called Love Laramie. And I'm just wondering if we might have a issue of confusion when we have a member who also spends time on our council meetings who goes by the name Love Laramie. And I guess I'm wondering if we could potentially ask for a different name, just to eliminate some of this confusion with this new nonprofit that we have in town. So I just don't want the two to be confused.
Okay.
And I don't know quite how, actually I don't know quite how to address that, but I think we could have a pending issue there.
Okay. Well,
That's it.
I'm sure that they, as we make, they become aware, they will work through that. If you have any suggestions for them, go to the different organizations and see what, thoughts you have also. Councilor Harrington?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just wanted to thank Councilor Pierce for serving on behalf of the Laramie Public Art Coalition, for serving on that committee. Those selection committees can take a considerable amount of time, and the board is appreciative of that. And then I guess I should have added this as an update, but I applied and was accepted to the Pilot Hill Board, and I will be serving on that in an ex officio capacity, not as an official city liaison, but will function as so. So if you would all like updates, I'm happy to provide them.
Sure, that'd be great. Okay, Councilor Weaver, I believe you had an update, or a comment, I'm sorry, council comment.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Councilor O'Doherty already addressed the first part of it, which was the concern about pending legislation that might affect net metering, which might in turn affect some of the city's plans. The second comment I have is, I'm not sure if we'll be able to do this, Mr. Mayor, but if we could, I would like to hear from city management about what our approach will be with assisting the county regarding the mask order for Laramie and Albany County. I'm curious because I've fielded some, I'll just describe them as angry and disappointed comments from people about some news pieces that also touched on that topic. And I said that I would follow up and see exactly what it is that our approach will be. So that is my comment, Mr. Mayor, is that I'm hoping I can get some more information about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There are weekly meetings with the county and the city and other groups, so that will be a topic. Thank you for that. Okay, let's go next to the agenda review. If you get this, I'm going to go through this rather quickly because there's not a lot of new information, but there is some that I think that we need to go through. First of all, let's go to the consent agenda, and I'm going to just touch on two topics, then I'm going to ask the council if there's something else you want clarification on. The first one is well, that's been removed. Okay, just one, two topics. The first one is 3rd Street Partners preliminary plat. You probably all remember that we did the 3rd Street, 3 readings. That's put the, that's all passed. This is just an additional portion of that we have to go through 3 readings on also, or the preliminary and final plat on those. So that's something new. Is it 1 reading? There's no final, there's just a preliminary, okay. And this is in addition to that Paledna addition, and so it's just another piece of that. Then the legislative meet and greet, we're going to try to hold that in council chambers, and it's probably going to be a virtual meeting so that we can have a chance to meet with them, and that's scheduled, as you can see, under the schedule of meetings. Anything on the consent or anything on the agenda up to that point anyone wants to ask questions about? Let's go to the regular agenda. As you can see, there's 3 resolutions on budget amendments, and this is just to, it's kind of to get us to where we have everything in order, looking at the agenda that we have to update and make changes to. So it's something that we do quite often. And as you can see, there's one for COVID 2018, that's the biennial. We're just taking the COVID things that apply during 2020. Then the sludge pumps. This is an award and also service contracts for the solid waste, and this is a very expensive project, but it's one that we have budgeted, and it will
Needs to be done.
and and it's something that we need to stay on top of, and we will. Now, then under item 16, general obligation bonds. These are Malia's on with us. These are bonds that we have for various projects, some that are in the enterprise fund, and I believe also some that came out of the specific purpose tax. Malia, anything you want to highlight on the general obligation bonds?
Yes, Mayor. Basically, what we're doing is for the SPT tax, when we did the election, we said we were going to bond some of the projects. The 2 projects are what we're going to be doing is for streets and for the fire tower.
Okay. And then we go to the second reading of the Traffic Commission and the manufacturing rectal alcohol, second reading on that. Now, anything on the regular or consent agenda anyone wants to ask questions about or get clarification? All right, easy enough. Then the next thing we have on our agenda, since we've gone through the agenda reviews, we're back to public comments. Anyone that wants to make public comments, you'll have 3 minutes, and we'll open it up to whoever wants to unmute and make public comments. Again, you'll have 3 minutes. Bern, I felt like that we didn't give you ample time. Did you want to make some thoughts or any comments on the session or any other item?
Well, yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. There was just one final point that I had thought would be useful in terms of just that overall, where does the WANC report fit in? And that was to point out that when we focus on nitrates, we need to understand that those are just kind of the black sheep. There's a whole lot of other things going on with respect to what's coming through septic systems. The chemical and pharmaceutical industries may spend every day finding new and exciting ways to improve our lives. The toxicologists struggle to keep up. So there's just a lot more going on out there, and we need to just keep that in mind. It all gets to the same point that was discussed pretty thoroughly, which is proceed with caution. So thank you for that, and look forward to the continuing discussion.
Great. And again, thank you for all of your input and all of your hard work in this area. Anyone else want to make public comments?
Put his hand up there, love Laramie.
Maximus? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
So a couple of things that I think I need to address. First, the issue of a political statement. I'm sitting here scratching my head because I did not think I made a political statement. What I was trying to do was an honest attempt to see if there were any recommendations by a subject matter expert as to the nature of the problem that I believe is probably not a novel one, not a case of first impression. I'm sure there's a lot of municipalities that are confronted with their water source and how to mitigate potential contamination. And as someone that's worked in governance for a number of years for the US government, I can tell you, you know, if you spend some time with the research staff, you will find that there are best practices out there. There are lessons learned out there in terms of governance and policy making that would make your job a lot easier than trying to reinvent the wheels and get all the studies that are very expensive. You will find that there are other communities that have probably made policies that were good, that were bad, and you can learn from their mistakes and their successes, just as other humans can learn from other people's experiences and mistakes. So that was the attempt there. Unless talking about property rights somehow becomes political speech, which I don't think it does. Property rights are fully protected by the US Constitution. So that's first thing. The second, in terms of the name, I'm actually flattered that an organization decided to use the name that I've been using for months. And it really reflects my love for the city that I've chosen to be a part of. I will talk to them, as a matter of fact, I was planning on, because we want to be a supporter of that endeavor itself. And I'm sure there's no problems, you know, in terms of copyright. There's another organization called Love America. So I'm sure if there's an organization that wants to do community support type things named Love America, would not preempt that name since there's no copyright, as I know. So those are the issues. There's really no need to address them. Just, I think we may want to be, after the election, less sensitive. Hypersensitivity is not a good thing. And we all love this place, and we all want the best for this place. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Max. You were trying to speak to us when we were talking about art. Did you have something you wanted to say to the council or to the public? Sharon, you're still muted. *6. All right, we'll come back to you if there's... Is there anyone else who would like to make council comments? Or public
Mr.
comments,
Mayor.
I'm sorry. Yes.
Well, you asked for council comments, but then you switched back to public comments. So,
But you're welcome to make another comment, Councilor Weaver.
yes, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to address the previous points that were just raised, although we don't usually do that in a work session. I'm going to insist that we allow it. My comment about political statements was directed at members of the council, not members of the public. So it's interesting to hear about sensitivity.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Anyone else who would like to make public comments? All right, seeing none, we will adjourn from our work session. Good night, everyone.
Part of the action. Immerse your family in cowboy culture. High mountain plains foster the real cowboy spirit. Visit Laramie this summer, where the West comes alive with you in it. Laramie, Wyoming. That's why